Script, Section 1, 1000 words. The hum of the airplane engines provided a constant backdrop to the first-class cabin, where passengers reclined in plush seats, sipping on champagne or scrolling through their devices. Everything seemed perfect, until an abrasive voice shattered the peace. "Why do they let people like him into first class? Thought this section was for professionals, not oversized circus acts." A man's sharp tone rang out. Heads turned, some with shock, others with disbelief. Shaquille O'Neal, towering and unmistakable, sat calmly in his seat. His hands rested on his lap as he looked up at the man, tall but not nearly as imposing, and offered a small, measured smile. The racist man, wearing a tailored suit and exuding arrogance, smirked smugly as if expecting a reaction. Several passengers exchanged uneasy glances, their discomfort palpable. A few whispered among themselves but remained silent, unwilling to confront the man or intervene. "Excuse me, sir, could you lower your voice?" A flight attendant cautiously approached, her professionalism strained by the tension in the air. The man waved her off dismissively. "It's not my fault this flight lets just anyone in here," he sneered, gesturing vaguely toward Shaq. Shaq leaned forward slightly, his voice calm but commanding. "What's your name, man?" The question seemed to catch the man off guard. "Why does that matter to you?" "It matters," Shaq replied, his tone unshaken. "Because I'd rather address you as a person than as someone making a mistake." The cabin grew quieter. Passengers, flight attendants, even the businessman himself seemed momentarily stunned by Shaq's response. The man scoffed but hesitated, the bravado in his expression faltering. "Daniel," he muttered, folding his arms across his chest defensively. "Well, Daniel," Shaq said, sitting back and relaxing into his chair. "I'm just here to fly like everyone else. But if my presence makes you uncomfortable, maybe you should ask yourself why that is." The weight of Shaq's words hung in the air, his calm demeanor in stark contrast to the venom in Daniel's voice. Nearby, Amelia, a woman in her early 30s with tired eyes but a warm smile, watched the exchange intently. She was seated with a window view, clutching a book she hadn't touched since boarding. Her gaze darted between Shaq and Daniel, her emotions a mix of anger and admiration. Daniel scoffed again, louder this time, as though trying to re-establish control. "Why don't you save your moral speeches for someone who cares? People like you always play the victim." Amelia gasped quietly, unable to believe the audacity. Several other passengers averted their eyes, pretending to be engrossed in their devices or meals. Shaq, however, remained unshaken. "Victim?" he said, his voice still calm. "Nah, I've been blessed in ways you can't imagine. But let me tell you something, words matter. You might think what you said was just your opinion, but opinions can hurt, especially when they're based on ignorance." Daniel rolled his eyes, his attempt at dismissiveness failing to mask the hint of unease creeping into his posture. A man across the aisle finally spoke up, his tone firm. "Hey, maybe you should stop talking and just enjoy the flight. You're making everyone uncomfortable." "Exactly," a woman nearby added. "This is ridiculous." Daniel glanced around, his earlier confidence beginning to crumble under the weight of the passengers' collective disapproval. His gaze fell back on Shaq, who sat as steady and unyielding as a mountain. "Enjoy your flight, Daniel," Shaq said simply, his tone carrying no malice, only quiet resolve. Amelia couldn't hold back any longer. "You handled that with so much grace," she said softly, leaning slightly toward Shaq. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but the sincerity in it was unmistakable. Shaq turned toward her, offering a kind smile. "Some battles aren't worth fighting with anger. People like him? They need to learn, not be fought." She nodded, her admiration for him growing with every passing second. "I wish I had that kind of patience." "It's not patience," Shaq replied. "It's knowing that how you respond says more about you than it does about them." Amelia smiled faintly, her grip on her book loosening. Daniel, meanwhile, had sunk into his seat, his bravado fully extinguished. The cabin settled back into an uneasy calm, but the tension lingered in the air like a storm cloud refusing to dissipate. As the flight attendants resumed their duties and passengers tried to return to their previous activities, Amelia couldn't shake the feeling that something profound had just occurred. In a single moment, Shaq had taken an insult meant to diminish him and transformed it into a lesson not just for Daniel, but for everyone on board. The engines hummed steadily as the plane continued its journey, but for Amelia, the trip had already become unforgettable. Script, Section 2, 950 words. The cabin lights flickered as the plane jolted sharply, drawing gasps and murmurs from the passengers. A crackling announcement from the captain followed. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some turbulence. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. Our crew is working to ensure your safety." The unease that had filled the cabin earlier was now replaced by a growing fear. Trays rattled, and overhead compartments creaked as the plane shuddered again, harder this time. Amelia clutched the armrest, her knuckles widening as her breath quickened. Across the aisle, a child began to cry, and passengers exchanged worried glances. Shaq sat upright, his massive frame steady despite the turbulence. His deep voice cut through the rising tension. "Hey y'all, it's gonna be okay. Planes are built for this stuff. Just breathe." His words carried a surprising calm that seemed to ripple outward. Passengers who had been visibly panicking a moment before now looked to him for reassurance. Even the crying child quieted slightly as their parent whispered something soothing, clearly encouraged by Shaq's demeanor. But Daniel, the man who had insulted him earlier, was visibly unraveling. His arrogance had given way to pure panic. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he gripped the armrests of his seat, muttering to himself. "This is bad. This is really bad," he said, his voice trembling. "What if we crash?" Shaq glanced at him, his expression unreadable. "Daniel," he said firmly but not unkindly, "we're not crashing. The crew's got this." Daniel shook his head, his breathing shallow. "You don't know that. What if something goes wrong? What if—" "Hey," Shaq interrupted, his tone softening. "You're scared. That's okay. But panicking won't help. Focus on breathing, man. In and out. Slow and steady." Daniel stared at him, as if unsure whether to listen. But as the plane jolted again, his grip on the armrests tightened, and he finally followed Shaq's advice, drawing in shaky breaths. Amelia, despite her own fear, couldn't help but admire the way Shaq handled the situation. He didn't just exude calm, he actively shared it, grounding everyone around him. She felt a flicker of reassurance herself, even as her heart continued to race. A few rows ahead, a flight attendant struggled to keep her balance as she moved down the aisle, checking on passengers. Shaq raised a hand to get her attention. "Ma'am," he said, his voice carrying easily over the cabin noise, "do y'all need any help? I can pitch in." The flight attendant hesitated, clearly torn between maintaining protocol and accepting his offer. After a moment, she nodded. "We might need assistance if things escalate," she said. "Just let me know," Shaq replied. The turbulence worsened, and the captain's voice returned. "We're encountering more severe weather than expected. As a precaution, we'll be making an unscheduled landing at the nearest airport. Please remain seated and follow all crew instructions." The announcement sent another wave of murmurs through the cabin. A young mother in the back was trying to comfort her toddler, who was now sobbing inconsolably. Another passenger, an older man, appeared to be having trouble breathing, clutching at his chest. Shaq unbuckled his seatbelt, despite the warning signs overhead, and moved toward the older man. "Sir, you okay?" he asked, his concern evident. The man shook his head, wheezing as he tried to speak. A flight attendant hurried over with an oxygen mask, but she was clearly overwhelmed by the chaos unfolding around her. Shaq gently took the mask from her and carefully placed it over the man's face, adjusting the straps. "There you go," he said, his voice steady. "Just breathe slow. You're gonna be fine." The older man's breathing gradually evened out, and he gave Shaq a weak but grateful nod. Daniel watched all of this with a mixture of awe and discomfort. The man he had insulted, mocked for his size and presence, was now the one stepping up to help, while he himself remained frozen in fear. Amelia noticed Daniel's reaction and couldn't resist commenting. "Funny, isn't it?" she said quietly. "How the person you judge the most turns out to be the one holding everything together." Daniel didn't respond, but his face reddened slightly, and he looked away. The turbulence began to subside, and the cabin grew quieter as the immediate crisis passed. Passengers who had been clutching their armrests now relaxed slightly, though the tension in the air remained. Shaq returned to his seat, nodding briefly to the flight attendant, who mouthed a "thank you" in his direction. Amelia leaned toward him again, her voice low. "You didn't have to do all that," she said. He shrugged, a small smile playing on his lips. "Maybe not. But sometimes doing something helps everybody feel a little less scared. Even me." Amelia tilted her head, surprised by his honesty. "You get scared?" "Everybody does," Shaq replied. "Difference is what you do with it. You let it freeze you, or you use it to focus." She nodded thoughtfully, his words resonating with her. Across the aisle, Daniel sat silently, his gaze fixed on the floor. The captain's voice returned once more, announcing that they would be landing shortly. As the plane descended, the atmosphere in the cabin shifted again, this time toward cautious relief. For Amelia, the flight was far from over, but she already knew she would remember it for a long time, and not just because of the turbulence. The plane touched down with a heavy thud, followed by the screech of tires on wet tarmac. The collective tension in the cabin released in a wave of relieved sighs and murmurs. The unscheduled landing had brought them to a small regional airport, its terminal barely visible through sheets of rain streaming down the windows. The captain's voice crackled through the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. Due to severe weather, we'll be deplaning here temporarily. Please remain seated until instructed." Shaq leaned back in his seat, his broad shoulders visibly relaxing. Around him, the passengers were already gathering their belongings, eager to disembark and escape the tension-filled flight. Amelia, still seated nearby, watched him with a mix of curiosity and admiration. "You didn't even flinch during all that," she said, her tone light but genuine. Shaq chuckled softly, glancing at her. "Been through worse storms. This? Just another day." Amelia smiled, her own nerves slowly settling. She glanced over at Daniel, who sat stiffly in his seat, staring straight ahead. His earlier arrogance had been replaced by a visible unease, and for the first time, he seemed entirely out of place. When the cabin doors finally opened, the passengers began filing out, their conversations buzzing with relief and nervous energy. Shaq stood, his towering frame drawing attention as he retrieved his carry-on from the overhead compartment. Amelia hesitated, then stepped into the aisle behind him, her curiosity getting the better of her. Outside, the rain was relentless, drenching the tarmac and creating puddles that reflected the harsh glow of airport floodlights. The passengers were ushered into a modest terminal building, its interior cramped and outdated. Shaq found a quiet corner to sit, his presence commanding even in stillness. Amelia approached him hesitantly, holding a small cup of coffee she had grabbed from a vending machine. "Mind if I join you?" He gestured to the empty seat beside him. "Not at all." As she sat, she studied him for a moment before speaking. "You know, most people would have lost their temper back there. With the turbulence, with, well, everything." Shaq shook his head, a faint smile on his lips. "Anger's easy. It's quick, feels good for a second. But it doesn't fix anything." Amelia nodded slowly, her gaze thoughtful. "You seem to have a lot of practice at keeping your cool." "Comes with the territory," Shaq replied, his tone calm but deliberate. "When you're built like me, people make assumptions. You either prove them wrong, or you live down to what they expect." Her eyes widened slightly at his candor. She hadn't expected such honesty from someone so larger than life. "That's a heavy burden to carry." He shrugged. "It's life. You learn to carry it, or it carries you." Their conversation was interrupted by a commotion near the entrance. Daniel stood at the counter, arguing with an airport staff member. His voice, though quieter than on the plane, carried the same sharp edge. "I need to get out of here," he insisted. "This whole detour is unacceptable." "Do you have any idea who I am?" The staff member, a young woman with an air of practiced patience, responded calmly. "Sir, we're doing everything we can. Please wait with the other passengers." Daniel threw up his hands in frustration, muttering under his breath as he stalked away. His gaze landed on Shaq and Amelia, and for a moment he hesitated before approaching them. "Look, he began awkwardly, scratching the back of his neck. "I wanted to, say something. About earlier." Shaq raised an eyebrow but said nothing, waiting for him to continue. Daniel shifted uncomfortably, his usual bravado nowhere to be found. "I was out of line. I shouldn't have said what I said. It was wrong." Amelia watched the exchange closely, her curiosity piqued. Shaq regarded Daniel for a long moment before speaking. "Apologies a start," he said simply. "What you do after matters more." Daniel looked taken aback, as though he had expected either anger or dismissal, not this calm acceptance. "Yeah, I'll think about that," he muttered, his tone uncertain. As Daniel walked away, Amelia turned to Shaq, her expression a mix of surprise and admiration. "You just let it go like that? What's the point in holding on?" Shaq replied, his tone as steady as ever. "Forgiveness isn't about him. It's about not letting his mistake live rent-free in my head." Amelia considered his words, a small smile tugging at her lips. "You're full of surprises, you know that?" Shaq chuckled softly. "You've said that a few times now." "Well, it's true," she said, her tone teasing but sincere. Their conversation shifted, becoming lighter as they shared stories about past flights, their favorite travel destinations, and the little quirks of life on the road. For Amelia, the storm outside seemed to fade, replaced by a growing sense of connection with the man beside her. As the rain continued to pour, the terminal buzzed with the collective energy of stranded passengers. But in their quiet corner, Shaq and Amelia found something unexpected, a moment of peace, and perhaps, the beginning of something more. The hours dragged on in the small terminal, with passengers growing restless and weary. Many had taken to pacing the limited space, while others dozed uncomfortably in their seats. The rain showed no signs of letting up, and the announcements about the flight's status were few and far between. Amelia sat beside Shaq, their conversation flowing as easily as it had before, though now it dipped into more personal topics. "So, do you always take charge in situations like that?" she asked, a playful lilt in her voice. Shaq smiled, a deep chuckle rumbling from his chest. "Not always. But when you're my size, people tend to look your way when something goes wrong. It's a habit now, I guess." She tilted her head, studying him. "You seem to handle it well. Like even when that guy, Daniel was it, was acting like a complete jerk, you didn't lose your cool." Shaq leaned back, his expression thoughtful. "You learn over time. The first time someone calls you out your name, it stings. The second time, it makes you mad. By the 100th time, you figure out it's not worth the energy. That stuff says more about them than it ever could about me." Amelia nodded, her gaze distant as she processed his words. "That's a perspective I wish I'd had earlier in life," she admitted. "I used to let people's opinions define me. Took me a long time to let go of that." He looked at her curiously. "What changed?" She smiled faintly, her fingers tracing the rim of the empty coffee cup in her hand. "My son. He's 6 now. Smart, funny, full of questions. He looks at me like I can do no wrong, and it made me realize I couldn't let other people's negativity shape who I am. I had to be someone he could look up to." Shaq's expression softened. "That's a good reason to grow," he said. "Kids have a way of showing us what really matters." Amelia glanced at him, her curiosity piqued. "What about you? Any kids?" He shook his head. "Not yet. But I've got nieces and nephews who keep me busy. Love them like they're my own." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of raised voices nearby. Daniel, once again, was at the center of attention. This time, He was arguing with another passenger, his frustration spilling over as he gestured wildly. "Why don't you just mind your business?" Daniel snapped. The other passenger, a younger man, didn't back down. "Because you're making everyone's night worse with your attitude," he shot back. "We're all stuck here. You're not special." Shaq sighed, standing up from his seat. "Excuse me," he said to Amelia before making his way over to the commotion. As he approached, the tension in the air seemed to shift. Shaq didn't say a word at first, simply positioning himself between the two men. His presence alone was enough to make them pause. "All right, y'all," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Let's not make this harder than it already is. We're all tired, but fighting won't change the weather." The younger man backed off, muttering under his breath as he returned to his seat. Daniel, however, lingered, his shoulders tense. "Why do you keep stepping in?" he asked, his voice low. "You trying to make me look bad?" Shaq met his gaze evenly. "No, man. I'm trying to keep things from getting worse. For everybody, including you." Daniel opened his mouth as if to respond, then closed it again, his expression conflicted. After a moment, he muttered something unintelligible and walked away, leaving Shaq to return to his seat. Amelia watched him as he sat down, shaking his head slightly. "You're a patient man," she said. "Gotta be," he replied. "If I matched his energy, nothing good would come of it. Somebody's gotta be the grown-up in the room." Their conversation resumed, shifting to lighter topics as the hours passed. Shaq shared stories from his career, peppering them with humor and self-deprecating charm that had Amelia laughing despite the dreary circumstances. At one point, she leaned closer, her voice dropping slightly. "You know, it's funny. I never would have imagined a situation like this could lead to, I don't know, meeting someone like you." He smiled, his eyes warm. "Life's funny like that. Sometimes the worst days bring the best surprises." The announcement of a delay extension brought groans from the passengers, but Shaq and Amelia hardly noticed. Their conversation had shifted again, growing more personal as they discovered shared values and interests. By the time the rain began to let up, the connection between them was undeniable. What had started as an ordinary, if frustrating, travel experience had turned into something unexpected, something meaningful. The terminal was quiet as the early morning hours crept in, the storm outside finally losing its ferocity. Most passengers had drifted into uneasy sleep, sprawled across chairs or leaning against walls. The dim lighting and hum of vending machines gave the space an almost surreal stillness. Amelia and Shaq, however, remained engaged in their conversation, their voices low but animated. The rapport between them had grown naturally, a rhythm of shared stories, thoughtful silences, and bursts of laughter. "I've got to ask," Amelia said, a mischievous glint in her eyes. "Do people ever recognize you and completely lose their minds?" Shaq chuckled, his smile widening. "All the time. Some folks play it cool at first, but you can see it in their eyes, they're freaking out. Others? No filter. They'll scream, cry, or just stand there frozen." Amelia laughed, imagining the scenarios. "I can see why. You're larger than life in every sense. Comes with the territory," he replied, leaning back comfortably. "But honestly, it's moments like this that I enjoy more. Just being a guy talking to someone, no cameras, no expectations." She tilted her head, intrigued. "That surprises me. I'd think you'd thrive on the spotlight." "Used to," he admitted. "But the older I get, the more I value the simple stuff. A real conversation, genuine connections. Fame's a tool, it opens doors, but it doesn't fill the important spaces." Amelia nodded, her gaze thoughtful. "That's refreshing to hear. I've always thought fame would make it hard to trust people. Like, how do you know if someone likes you for you or for the image they've built in their head?" Shaq's expression turned serious. "That's a real challenge. But over time, you get better at reading people. And when someone's real, it stands out." She smiled softly, their eyes meeting for a brief moment that seemed to stretch. "Well, for what it's worth, I think you're pretty good at being real." "Appreciate that," he said, his voice warm. And you're not too bad yourself. Before the moment could deepen further, an announcement crackled through the speakers, breaking the quiet. The flight was being rescheduled for later in the day, allowing the passengers time to rest or explore the small town near the airport. The news was met with a mix of groans and relieved chatter. Some passengers began making plans to leave the terminal, while others settled back into their seats. Amelia looked at Shaq, an idea forming in her mind. So, we've got a few hours to kill, she said casually. Think you'd be up for grabbing some breakfast? Assuming this place has a diner or something. Shaq raised an eyebrow, his smile teasing. Are you asking me out, Amelia? She laughed, a hint of color rising to her cheeks. Let's call it a friendly meal between two strangers who happen to be stuck in the same place. Friendly meal it is, he said, standing and stretching his massive frame. Let's see what this town's got to offer. The pair made their way out of the terminal, stepping into the damp, early morning air. The rain had reduced to a light drizzle, and the town, though small, had an undeniable charm. They found a diner just a short walk away, its neon sign flickering against the gray sky. Inside, the atmosphere was warm and inviting. The smell of fresh coffee and frying bacon filled the air as they slid into a booth near the window. Over plates of pancakes and eggs, their conversation deepened further. Amelia opened up about her life as a single mother, the challenges of balancing work and parenting, and her hopes for the future. I just want my son to grow up knowing he can be anything he wants, she said, her voice tinged with both determination and vulnerability. I want him to see the world as a place full of possibilities, not limits. Shaq listened intently, his expression thoughtful. You're giving him the most important thing already, a strong example. He'll see how hard you work, how much you care. That kind of foundation can take him far. She smiled, her eyes glistening slightly. Thanks. That means a lot coming from you. They shifted to lighter topics, Shaq sharing stories of his travels and the unexpected adventures he'd had along the way. His humor was infectious, and Amelia found herself laughing more than she had in months. As they finished their meal, the waitress approached with the check. Shaq reached for it, but Amelia stopped him with a playful glare. You might be larger than life, but I can pay for breakfast. He raised his hands in mock surrender. All right. But I'm leaving the tip. Fair enough, she said, grinning. As they left the diner, the clouds began to part, the first rays of sunlight breaking through. They walked back to the terminal at a leisurely pace, the quiet moments between them filled with a comfortable ease. Amelia glanced at him as they neared the building. You know, this wasn't how I pictured this trip going, but I'm glad it turned out this way. Shaq smiled, his expression warm. Me too. Sometimes the detours end up being the best part of the journey. Their steps slowed as they reached the entrance, neither of them quite ready to step back into the chaos of the terminal. For the first time in a long time, Amelia felt a sense of peace, like she'd found something she didn't even know she was looking for. As the hours ticked by, the terminal began to stir with renewed activity. The storm had passed, leaving behind a calm, gray sky streaked with the first hints of sunlight. Passengers returned from nearby motels, coffee shops, and quiet nooks where they'd taken refuge during the delay. Amelia and Shaq found themselves back in their original seats, now sharing a sense of camaraderie born from hours of genuine conversation. Across the room, Daniel sat alone, his once overbearing demeanor replaced by a restless energy. He glanced around, his gaze occasionally landing on Shaq. The man seemed conflicted, his earlier bravado diminished by time and the social isolation of the group. Shaq noticed, his eyes narrowing slightly in thought. Amelia leaned closer, speaking softly. He hasn't said much since the argument. Think he's stewing? Maybe, Shaq replied, his voice low. Or maybe he's realizing the weight of his actions. Sometimes it takes a little quiet for the noise in your head to clear. Amelia studied Shaq, impressed yet again by his ability to see beyond the surface. You're a better person than me, she said with a wry smile. I don't think I'd have the patience to consider his perspective. Shaq shrugged. It's not about patience, it's about understanding that change doesn't happen overnight. If someone's willing to take the first step, you've got to meet them halfway. As if on cue, Daniel stood, hesitating for a moment before approaching. His shoulders were hunched, and his expression was uncertain, a far cry from the arrogance he displayed earlier. "Hey," Daniel said, his voice subdued. Shaq looked up, his expression calm but unreadable. "What's up?" Daniel shifted uncomfortably, his hands stuffed into his pockets. I wanted to say I'm sorry. For what I said earlier. It was out of line." Amelia watched the exchange silently, her posture tense. Shaq, however, remained composed, his gaze steady as he considered Daniel's words. "All right," Shaq said finally, his tone measured. "But an apology's just words. What are you going to do about it?" Daniel blinked, clearly taken aback. "Do about it?" "Yeah," Shaq said, leaning forward slightly. "You acted the way you did because of something you believe. If you're sorry, that means you're rethinking those beliefs. So, what's the plan?" The question hung in the air, heavy with expectation. Daniel looked down, his brows furrowed as he grappled with the challenge. "I don't know," he admitted. "I guess I never thought about it like that. I was just mad, you know? At everything. And I took it out on you." "That's a start," Shaq said, his tone softening slightly. "But if you want things to change, you've got to do more than admit you're mad. You've got to figure out why and work on fixing it." Daniel nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "You're right. I'll think about it." Shaq extended a hand, surprising both Daniel and Amelia. "Good luck," he said simply. Daniel hesitated, then shook Shaq's hand, a flicker of something, gratitude, perhaps, crossing his face. He walked away, returning to his seat with a more subdued air. Amelia exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "I can't believe he actually apologized," she said, her voice tinged with disbelief. "People can surprise you," Shaq said with a small smile. "Sometimes they just need a little push in the right direction." Their conversation shifted once more, the weight of the interaction gradually giving way to lighter topics. They talked about their favorite books, shared childhood memories, and even debated the merits of different breakfast foods. As the announcement for boarding finally came, a collective cheer rose from the passengers. The mood in the terminal shifted to one of relief and anticipation as everyone gathered their belongings and prepared to board. Amelia stood, her bag slung over her shoulder, and glanced at Shaq. "Looks like this is it," she said, her voice carrying a note of reluctance. "Yeah," Shaq replied, standing to his full height. "It's been an interesting ride." They walked toward the boarding gate together, the hum of the crowd providing a backdrop to their quiet conversation. "So," Amelia said, her tone light but tinged with something deeper. "What's next for you after this flight?" Shaq shrugged. "Back to work, back to life. But who knows? Maybe this trip will be the start of something new." She smiled, her eyes warm. "Maybe." As they reached the gate, Shaq hesitated, turning to face her. "Hey, if you're ever in my neck of the woods, look me up," he said, his tone casual but sincere. Amelia's smile widened. "I just might do that." They exchanged contact information quickly, the flow of passengers urging them forward. As they boarded the plane, the moment lingered in Amelia's mind, a quiet promise of possibilities yet to come. Seated a few rows apart, they exchanged a final glance before the plane took off, the faint beginnings of sunlight illuminating the horizon. For Amelia, it was more than just the end of a long delay, it felt like the start of something new. The flight took off smoothly, the hum of the engines serving as a steady backdrop to the quiet buzz of conversation among passengers. Amelia sat in her seat, her hands folded in her lap, her thoughts lingering on the unexpected turn her day had taken. She glanced over at Shaq, seated a few rows ahead, his profile relaxed and calm as he flipped through a book. The connection they'd formed over the past few hours felt inexplicable, a blend of shared experiences and subtle understanding that neither had anticipated. Her mind drifted back to the earlier moment when Daniel had approached Shaq. She still couldn't quite believe he'd actually apologized, but there was something about the exchange that had stuck with her. Shaq's words had been simple, yet powerful, words she herself had struggled to find in difficult moments. His willingness to offer guidance without judgment had been remarkable. It made her think about the way she had approached her own life, especially as a mother. Amelia leaned back in her seat, her eyes tracing the patterns of light and shadow dancing on the windows. She had never been one to trust easily, but there was something about Shaq that made her feel like maybe, just maybe, there was more to this world than the small, isolated bubble she'd built for herself and her son. As the plane cruised steadily through the sky, she felt a strange mix of peace and uncertainty. The thought of stepping back into her routine, her work, her responsibilities, was always a bit daunting, but today felt different. Maybe it was the conversation with Shaq, or maybe it was the quiet apology from Daniel that had sparked something in her. It had been a long time since she'd allowed herself to believe in change, in growth. Shaq's phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. She glanced at him as he picked it up, quickly typing a response. The distraction gave her a moment of quiet reflection, a chance to breathe without the weight of the previous hours hanging over her. He glanced over at her, catching her gaze as she looked up. His eyes were warm, friendly. "Everything okay?" he asked, his tone light. Amelia nodded, offering a small smile. "Yeah. Just thinking." "About?" he prodded gently. She hesitated, then shook her head with a chuckle. "Nothing major. Just life, I guess. The way things happen. How people change." Shaq's expression softened, and he set his phone down. "I get that. It's funny how sometimes it takes a moment like this to see things differently." Amelia smiled knowingly, grateful for his understanding. "You're right. I've been stuck, I guess. Stuck in the same place for a long time." "You're not alone in that," Shaq said, his voice steady. "We all get stuck sometimes. It's how you break out of it that matters." Amelia was silent for a beat, pondering his words. "I think I'm starting to figure that out." Shaq smiled again, a quiet encouragement in his expression. "Good. It's a journey, but you've got a lot of strength in you." Their conversation shifted once more, becoming lighter as they shared stories about their respective lives. Amelia found herself laughing more freely, her earlier hesitations fading into the background. For the first time in what felt like forever, she felt a sense of possibility. As the flight continued, Amelia found herself drawn to the idea of personal growth in a way she hadn't considered before. It wasn't just about surviving each day, it was about choosing to move forward, to embrace change even when it felt uncomfortable. Shaq had shown her a side of resilience that wasn't about being unbreakable, but about bending and adapting, letting go of past hurt to make room for new opportunities. The rest of the flight passed in a blur, the hours slipping by faster than she had expected. By the time the captain announced their descent, Amelia felt a quiet sense of gratitude. The turbulence of the morning, both literal and emotional, had settled, leaving behind a calm clarity she hadn't realized she needed. As the plane touched down and the cabin lights flickered back on, Amelia gathered her things and stood, stretching her legs after the long flight. She glanced around the cabin, noting the exhaustion on the faces of other passengers, but there was a lightness in her step that hadn't been there before. Shaq had already risen from his seat, his towering frame moving with ease through the aisle. He caught her eye as they both began making their way toward the exit. "So," he said with a grin, "what's next for you?" Amelia paused, considering the question. "I guess I'm heading home. Back to my son, back to reality. But I'm thinking of making some changes. Starting with how I see things." Shaq nodded approvingly. "That's a good start. And remember, it's okay to take it one step at a time." She smiled, feeling lighter than she had in a long time. "Thanks for the reminder." They reached the gate, where the hustle of disembarking passengers filled the air. As they stepped out into the terminal, Amelia felt a strange sense of optimism, as though a door had opened that she hadn't seen before. Shaq turned to her, offering a hand. "It was good meeting you, Amelia. I'm glad we got to talk." She shook his hand, her grip firm. Likewise. You've definitely made this trip unforgettable. As they parted ways, Amelia couldn't help but feel the warmth of the conversation lingering. She didn't know exactly where her journey would take her, but for the first time in a long while, she felt ready to embrace whatever came next. The airport was bustling with activity as passengers gathered their belongings and moved toward baggage claim or transport connections. Amelia stepped off the plane with a sense of newfound clarity, her mind already racing through the steps she would need to take to implement the subtle changes she had promised herself. Her thoughts kept circling back to the conversation with Shaq. It hadn't been anything grand, just two people talking, but somehow, it felt like a turning point. She glanced at the text from her sister that had come through earlier, a reminder to pick up her son from school. The reality of life, work, responsibilities, the never-ending to-do list, was waiting for her, but for the first time in a while, she felt equipped to face it. Shaq's words had given her the confidence to look beyond the immediate, to see beyond the daily grind to what really mattered. Amelia had always been the kind of person to keep her head down and her goals focused. She worked hard to provide for her son, stayed ahead of bills, and made sure that every day ran smoothly, but lately, she'd felt disconnected. It was easy to fall into that rhythm, to live life like a checklist instead of truly experiencing it. The conversation with Shaq had reminded her that there was more out there. There were chances to change, to grow, and to embrace not just her role as a mother, but as an individual. As she made her way through the terminal toward the baggage claim, Amelia's phone buzzed again. She checked it quickly, half expecting another update from her sister, but it was something else. An email from work. A new assignment. It was exactly the type of thing she had expected. More work. More deadlines. But this time, her response felt different. Instead of the usual resignation that came with such messages, she felt a flicker of excitement. Maybe this new project could be an opportunity for her to prove something, both to herself and to those around her. She quickly typed a response, confirming her availability and suggesting a meeting time. Her hand hovered over the keyboard for a moment before she added a short line at the end. Looking forward to the challenge. For the first time, those words didn't feel like a mere formality. She meant them. She could face this new task with the same determination she'd always had. But now, there was something else, too. A sense of purpose. Her phone buzzed again, snapping her back to the present. It was a message from Shaq. She read it with a smile. Hope you make it home safe. You've got this. Amelia's heart warmed as she typed a quick reply. Thanks, Shaq. Really appreciate the conversation. I won't forget it. She stared at the screen for a moment before hitting send. The exchange had meant more to her than just a casual conversation between two strangers. It had been a reminder that there was a world beyond the comfort of routine and habit. There was a chance to grow, to break out of the box she had built for herself. She walked toward the carousel, her steps more purposeful now. The familiar hum of the airport was a contrast to the buzz in her head, but she was grateful for it. It grounded her, made her realize that life continued on, whether or not she was ready for it. But this time, she felt ready. Amelia's phone buzzed again. She glanced at it, but this time it wasn't a text or a work email. It was a notification from a self-improvement podcast she had subscribed to months ago, but had forgotten about. The subject line read, "The Power of Embracing Change." Amelia smiled at the irony. She clicked on the notification and listened to the first few seconds of the podcast. It was exactly what she needed to hear, a reminder that change wasn't something to fear, it was something to embrace. She wasn't sure how or when things had started to shift for her, but something was definitely different. Maybe it was the conversation with Shaq. Maybe it was the apology from Daniel. Or maybe it was simply the realization that she didn't have to do it all on her own. By the time she reached baggage claim, she was ready. Ready for whatever life threw at her next. Ready to change, to challenge herself in ways she hadn't before. She could already feel the weight lifting off her shoulders, the sense of possibility expanding. She collected her bag, threw it over her shoulder, and walked out of the airport with a new sense of purpose. The future didn't feel so daunting anymore. As she drove home, Amelia thought about her son waiting for her. She would pick him up, of course, but she would also do something else. She would talk to him about change, about the importance of being open to new perspectives and experiences. She would help him see the world beyond his immediate surroundings, just as Shaq had helped her see the world beyond her routine. Maybe that was what life was really about, not just surviving it, but finding the moments that could make you better, stronger, and more open to the unexpected. And for Amelia, today had been just that. A moment that, in its own quiet way, had changed everything. The road stretched out before her, the familiar landmarks passing by as she made her way home. She knew that there would still be challenges ahead, but now she felt ready to face them head on. Whatever came next, she would approach it with a new sense of openness, understanding, and possibility. When she arrived at home and saw her son running toward her, his smile wide, she knew that whatever happened, she was exactly where she needed to be. And for the first time in a long while, Amelia was excited to see what the next chapter of her life would bring.